Hey guys, welcome back. I know the hunting season is far from over and most of us still have tags to fill. However, in today's video, I want to talk about something that you guys should be doing right now to help set yourself up for a successful season next year. And that's creating a habitat checklist for this coming off season. Having a checklist to help prioritize the work that you want to accomplish this coming off season will really help you complete those short-term goals and those long-term goals on your property. So in this video, I want to talk about several things that you guys can be doing right now to help put that checklist together. And the first thing that I want to talk about is something that you guys can be doing while you're hunting, and that's making on-stand observations of the deer movement on your property. Hopefully throughout this past hunting season, you've been doing this, and if you haven't, there's still time. But that's making observations on how the deer are using your property right now. How are they currently moving through your property? For example, if your property has a very thick bedding area on a particular side of the property and you're noticing that most of the deer are entering and exiting that bedding area in a certain spot, that's something that you want to make note of so that you can either try to reinforce that movement, or if that movement does not fit within your overall habitat plan, then you need to find a way to manipulate that movement to try to change it so it better fits your overall plan. Another example of something that you might notice during the hunting season is that previously maybe the deer were cutting a certain corner on your property, but now maybe there's some downed trees that blew over during the late summer or early fall that are pushing the deer further away from your stand. And so you need to make a note, add it to your off-season checklist, that those deer's preferred trail is blocked. And you need to go in there and open that back up to push those deer closer to your stand. Again, these are just a few examples of the infinite possibilities of things that you might be noticing while you're on stand hunting this season. But one of the most important things you want to make sure that you're taking note of while you're hunting is how are these deer moving through my property, and what are some ways that I can reinforce that movement, or maybe what are some ways that I can manipulate or adjust that movement to give myself better hunting opportunities. Another thing that you want to make sure that you're doing while you're hunting this season, for those of you guys that do put in habitat improvements, is you want to observe how the deer are relating to your existing improvements. And you can do this either from personal observation, or you can do this with trail cameras, especially if you have your trail camera set to video mode. And some of these improvements are going to be used right away, while others are going to take a little bit longer for the deer to get used to them or even use them at all. So as a property owner and a land manager, you want to try your best to observe how these deer are using the property improvements that you have previously installed. Again, to give you guys a couple examples, something that you should see the deer hitting right away would be your mock scrapes. Maybe you're manipulating deer trails, trying to steer them through a certain part of your property. These are things that the deer should be using right away, and you'll be able to know if they're using them right away by hanging a few trail cameras. If you notice that the deer are using your improvements as you intended them to, make sure that you make a note to continue to make those improvements the same way going forward. However, if you are noticing that certain improvements on your property are not being used, maybe it's a mock scrape, maybe you installed a water hole that's not being used, maybe you have a particular food plot that the deer are not using, or maybe you have a bedding area on your property that it doesn't seem like the deer are coming and going to as often as you'd like, you need to try to make a note of that, so in the off season you can go in there to try to figure out maybe why they're not using those improvements. Maybe your mock scrapes and your water holes are in too thick a cover, so when those deer move into those locations, they really don't feel comfortable exposing themselves to get a drink or to work a scrape. If you're noticing that a food plot isn't getting as much daylight activity as you want, then you need to make sure that you're maybe checking your access around that food plot, make sure that it's screened appropriately. There are several factors that can contribute to having a nocturnal food plot, and if during this hunting season you notice that one of your food plots is a nocturnal food plot, then you need to try to figure out why. And again, those are just a few of the hundreds of observations that you could be noticing from the deer stand as to how these deer are relating to your existing improvements. But one of the most important things that you need to make sure that you're doing as a land manager is, if you're going to be taking all this time and putting in all this work to put in those habitat improvements, then you need to make sure that the deer are using them as intended. And again, if they're not, then you need to make a note of that so that you can hopefully go in this coming off season and correct the issue. The next thing I want to talk about as it relates to putting together your off-season habitat checklist are to put together some short-term and long-term goals for your property. And For me, this comes down to more macro habitat improvements compared to micro habitat improvements. So we'll kind of start out big picture and talk about more macro, big scale. If you want to consistently hold deer on your property, then you need to give them everything that they need so that they don't get tempted to leave to go somewhere else. And deer want 4 things to call a place home. They want food, cover, water, and a feeling of security. And so you need to do everything that you can to provide those things on your property to increase the chances that you're going to hold more deer on a consistent basis. And this is where looking at your property and the neighboring properties on a macro scale comes in when trying to develop those long-term habitat goals. And to me, the macro habitat improvements or the long-term habitat improvements, these are the improvements that are going to set the foundation for your property. These are extremely important for the overall long-term success of your property. And every property is going to be different when it comes to your big picture, your long-term, your macro improvements. And it's really going to kind of depend on your neighborhood habitat. And I'll kind of give you guys several examples here of different property types and what their long-term or what their macro habitat improvements might be. Let's say you have a property that's located in a big wood setting. So for the most part, in the surrounding area, you have nothing but cover. In that area, you don't really need to be focusing as much on installing more cover on your property. You need to be trying to put in as much food as possible because that's what the deer are lacking in that particular area. However, let's go to the complete flip side of that. If you're in an area that's primarily agriculture or open fields where there is an abundance of food but not a whole lot of cover, then you need to do the opposite, and you do not need to be focusing as much on food plots, but you need to focus more on cover. You need to try to provide something on your property that the deer do not get from the surrounding properties. And finally, you might have a property that's in more of a mixed setting where you have a pretty equal balance of cover and food. On these properties, you want to create both cover and food, and you don't necessarily have to place an emphasis on one over the other if it is truly balanced. However, me personally, in a very high pressure state like Michigan, I do like to shade my priorities more towards the cover side because I believe those older deer, they really relate to that cover in high pressure areas. And to give you guys a personal example of those macro, those long-term habitat goals for this particular property, and we've talked about it several times in the past, most of the neighboring properties surrounding this one are open fields, whether that's cow pasture, hayfield, rotating crop fields. There's not a whole lot of cover in the area. So one of the long-term goals for this property is to continue to provide high quality cover for the local deer herd. If we can provide high quality cover, there's a greater chance that we can hold more deer on this property. Now that does not mean we're not focusing on food plots. We put in food plots on this property every single year, but our overall long-term focus is to provide more and more cover every single year. Once you evaluated your property from a macro scale, you have those long-term habitat goals in place. Just kind of chip away at those year after year. You don't have to get all that done in one year. However, there are some things that you can get done in the following off-season to help improve your chances the following season. And those are those micro habitat improvements or those short-term goals. And these might be some of the observations that you made during the previous hunting season. Maybe you missed an opportunity at one of your target bucks because there was too much brush in the way, so you need to trim up a shooting lane. Maybe you want to blaze a new deer trail through a certain section of your property. Maybe you need to remove a downed tree that was blocking a particular deer trail, pushing them away from your stand. Maybe you found a great spot for a new mock scrape or water hole setup. These are improvements that can be done relatively quickly during this next coming off season to help improve your chances next hunting season. However, if you guys are stumped and you are having a harder time putting together your off-season habitat checklist, there are a few areas that you guys should be focusing on to determine what work needs to be done this coming off season. And so we'll just kind of go through a few things that hopefully you guys can remember from this previous hunting season to determine whether or not it either needs improvement or maybe it's okay for now and you can move on to something else. And the first one, and maybe it's one of the most important things that you need to focus on this coming off season or just in general, and that's your access on and off the property. If you're able to get to and from your stand locations without bumping deer, then you probably have your access shored up and you don't necessarily have to worry about it. However, If you are consistently bumping deer either on the way to your stand or on the way from your stand, or if there's ever an area along your access where you can look in to your property and see deer, then you need to work on that this coming off season and make sure that that's a primary focus so you can correct that issue before next hunting season. Your access on and off the property is one of the most important things to keeping your property pressure free and to keep you from kicking those deer off to your neighbors. Along the same lines as access, try to figure out if you need any additional screening on your property, whether that's an annual screen or you want to put in a perennial screen. Are there ever any areas on your property that you feel are too open and need to be screened off? Now that the leaves are down and you can see much further into the property, it's a great time to evaluate on whether or not you need additional screening. And if you're going with an annual screen, you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much right now because you can get those orders in next year. However, if you're looking for a perennial screen, whether that's switchgrass, miscanthus, you're looking for Norway spruce, any type of perennial screen, you want to make note of what you need so that you can get your order in now before those suppliers run out of their product. So we covered access, we covered screening. Another habitat improvement that you might want to implement on your property or improve upon are your bedding areas. Whether you want to create new bedding areas on your property or you want to go in and maintain existing bedding areas on your property, this is a great job to put on your habitat improvement checklist. You want to make sure that all those individual beds that you've made remain clear. You want to make sure that all those entrances and exits to those bedding areas are open and not blocked. So if you're struggling to figure out what should be on your habitat improvement checklist for this coming off season, definitely consider going in to maintain those existing bedding areas. And just like with maintaining those bedding areas, you want to make sure that those generational deer trails, those trails that the deer use year after year, remain clear. This is something that I make sure to put on my habitat improvement checklist every single year because I want to make sure that the deer movement on my property remains consistent year after year. And if you have something blocking one of your deer trails, that could be enough to push them around your stand and create a new generational trail. That is not something that you want. You want to make sure that those trails remain the same. And if that's the case, and I'm sure it is with a lot of your properties because it happens on my property almost every single season, then simply walking your primary deer trails will reveal that there's a potential issue that you can quickly resolve with a chainsaw. Another thing you might want to consider putting on your off-season habitat checklist is either maintaining or expanding existing food plots. When was the last time you got a soil test done? Do your food plots need more lime? What did you plant this past hunting season? And are you going to have to terminate that crop in the spring? Are your food plots getting enough sunlight? Are they screened appropriately? These are all questions that you guys can be asking yourselves as it relates to your food plots when trying to figure out what to put down on your off-season habitat checklist. Another really easy thing that you guys can be putting on your off-season checklist is just evaluating stand locations. Whether that's you think the stand is too far on the edge of your property, maybe you need to push it in a little further, maybe it's too far in and you need to bring it back. Maybe you need to bring your stand to a tree 20 yards in the opposite direction. We like to think that we're going to get everything right the first time, but realistically, that's not the case. You know, every once in a while, we're going to pick the wrong tree, or we're going to face the stand in the complete opposite direction than what it should be. And after the season, we need to evaluate, how our stands performed that previous season, and then adjust them accordingly. So this is something that we do every single season, and I bet you every year we move or adjust two stands to make sure that we have better opportunities the following season. And guys, the final thing that you should be doing once you have your off-season habitat checklist completed is to create a priority list within that list. Every year during the off-season, we have a lofty goal of completing everything on our habitat checklist, but realistically, most of the time we do not get everything on our list accomplished. In the early part of the off-season, we don't really have a whole lot of daylight to work with after work, outside of the weekends. And before you know it, it's summer and we have a lot more obligations, and those habitat improvements kind of get pushed aside. Whether you're going on family vacation, you have kids sporting events, there's life outside of hunting and habitat improvements. So you just want to make sure that you're setting a priority list within your habitat improvement checklist so that you're making sure that you get the most important improvements on your checklist completed before next season. And there are so many more examples that we can talk about as it relates to putting together your habitat checklist. But for the most part, it's going to come down to the specific needs of your individual property. And really only you know what those needs are. But hopefully in this video, we've given you guys a few ideas to get that list started. Try your best to chip away at those macro habitat improvements, those long-term habitat goals that you have for your property. Try your best to install as many of those micro improvements before next hunting season. And having a detailed habitat improvement checklist will help you stay focused and on track as you improve your property year after year. Well guys, that pretty much wraps it up on how to create a habitat improvement checklist and some of the things that you guys should be focusing on when putting your checklist together. If you guys have any other suggestions on some of the items or areas that people should be focusing on when putting their habitat checklist together, I'd love to hear about it. If you have any questions, please drop those in the comment section below. I'll get back to those as soon as I can, and we will see you guys in the next video.